I just thought of another series as I was delivering food and as I was reading a news story, and I have a thing about texts that are meant to convert people to things. Call me a former evangelical Christian, or one that's still in there at some point, still has that walk, but walks it different, like this. Alright, I don't know where this is coming from. But here's chapter 1. Let's see how it goes.
Harry Potter and the Throbbing Wands of Emotionality. This is exactly like the chapter 1 that you just read from Harry Potter and the Methods of Rationality, but through the lens of a reason and emotionality, because emotion is the incubator of reason, and a reason is but another form of reason, just one that gives the oddest gifts on the holidays. Harry Potter and the Throbbing Wands of Emotionality, chapter 1. The envelope had gone missing from his pocket, but that was hardly his main concern at the moment. Harry stood frozen in front of the living room, staring at his mother's tear-streaked cheeks and his father's grim expression. It was like looking at a photograph with two completely different descriptions of what it was supposed to be showing. The professor was trying to comfort his mother, or rather, trying to assure her that he loved her and would forgive her despite the enormous stupidity of her sister. Only he was getting a bit distracted by the realization that he hadn't been entirely right about whether his wife could use magic or not, and how was anyone going to explain the adoption agency not noticing that? But that was less important than calming down his clearly agitated wife. But then he started wondering exactly how she had kept his attention away from the fact that Lily was a witch and that their son had disappeared after shouting for owls. And then it all just got complicated and tangled up in his head. And somehow that left him back on the subject of magic again, and whether or not it was really real or just some gigantic conspiracy, which meant he wasn't a good scientist at all, just easily distracted. And how was that possible, especially with him being a professor and all? He knew that Petunia didn't want him to blame himself, but if there was anything he could think of to blame, it would be his own inability to keep his mind on one issue at a time. And in the meantime, Harry had turned and run out the door, driven by the certainty that it couldn't be real, not after all this, because how could he possibly go to a school for witches and wizards? If it were true, how had the world hidden it from everyone for so long? He needed to prove to himself that it couldn't be true. He had to break the strange mental block and then come back home and assure everyone that there were no such thing as witches or magic or Hogwarts, even though they couldn't possibly know the truth without his confirmation. It felt so wrong to have this weird mental block and strange certainty inside of him. It reminded him too much of when he had gotten lost in London and the map had insisted on drawing lines that didn't correspond to the layout of the streets. He'd gotten turned around 100 times and finally decided that he had to ignore the map altogether so that he could focus on where he really was instead of what the map thought he ought to be seeing. This time he needed to ignore what the strange certainty in his head was telling him to do, and see if he could really summon an owl. It would feel good to smash that certainty and go back into the living room triumphant, waving some other mundane explanation for the whole thing. It had been a mistake or a prank. Nothing more than that. He reached Mrs. Fig's house, his feet automatically finding his way there even in the dark, and he rang the doorbell. He waited a couple of minutes, hearing someone shuffle to the door and open it slowly, and then it opened all the way, and Harry gasped at the man standing behind her. It was Professor Quirrell, his science teacher from school. Quirrell didn't seem to recognize him at first, but after a few moments of frowning, his expression seemed to change. "Potter," he said slowly, the name drawn out as if he were thinking back on it. Harry Potter? But they've never seen you with any magical talent before. Harry was suddenly nervous. He didn't have any talent for magic. That much was true, but Professor Quirrell wasn't supposed to believe in magic. Not any more than Harry was. But now he had to go with it, so he gave a nod and an apologetic smile. It's only recently that it started to really show up. Quirrell rubbed his chin thoughtfully. Interesting. I wouldn't have imagined it. Well, the fact that I'm a muggle-born is part of how I can teach magical history with authority. Perhaps this is something similar. And perhaps, yes, you'll make a great addition to Hogwarts, Mr. Potter. Mr. Potter? Was it supposed to be that formal? No matter, he had to push through. Thank you, Professor. May I speak with Mrs. Fig, please? She's busy, Quirrell said quickly. He was still sizing up Harry, like he was trying to work out how he was going to fit him into one of his lectures. We must get you on the express train at once, before any Muggle authorities notice. Authorities? Harry said nervously. Professor Quirrell wouldn't try to arrest him, would he? Why on earth would he do that? The professor's eyes were wide. Harry Potter, surely you haven't been living completely Muggle your whole life, without any idea of what might be lurking around every corner. No, none of this was right. Harry didn't want to just leap onto an express train to wizard school without testing the hypothesis. He couldn't just go straight to Hogwarts. Professor, actually Quirrell shook his head. Nonsense. Mr. Potter, Hogwarts will take good care of you. Don't worry, I'll help you find everything you need to feel at home. Just take a moment. Gather your things, say goodbye to your parents, they mustn't know you're going. He turned, muttering something to Mrs. Fig, who stood there looking pale and shaken. Well, Harry, come on, we can't lose any time. Quirrell pulled out one and tapped the envelope 3 times, chanting words that Harry didn't recognize. There was a loud crack, and they were standing somewhere else. But where were they? He knew the city of London like the back of his hand, but he hadn't recognized anything they'd passed through, not even a vague sense of where they might be. And in front of them was could it be Hogwarts Castle? It had to be. Quirrell was staring at it with a fond expression and a sense of familiarity, as though he had been here countless times before. Here we are, Quirrell murmured, looking up at the turrets. Back again. Oh, but it's been so long. Harry was shaking. None of this felt right. Where was he? Why couldn't he just return to reality? Hadn't he tested the hypothesis enough? Was there really no escape? He had been right. There was no Hogwarts. He felt foolish for ever believing it. And then a voice called out from the front doors of the castle, and Harry froze in shock and amazement. Professor Quirrell, welcome back. It's been far too long. It was the deputy headmistress, the brilliant Minerva McGonagall, known for her fierce intellect and sharp wit, and here she was at Hogwarts Castle. But where was he? The thought had been nagging at him for a while now. Hadn't the real McGonagall died ages ago? Had Professor Quirrell brought him to an entirely different dimension? But if that was the case, why wasn't this world falling apart, or at least more chaotic? The deputy headmistress hadn't appeared in an outdated outfit, or behaved like anything other than a normal adult.
Such exposition, Potter.
Professor McGonagall, a pleasure as always. Do you remember my student Harry Potter? Wait, Quirrell had called him Harry Potter, just like in his mother's vision. How did that fit together? Wasn't his name James Potter? Was there something wrong with his brain? Something preventing him from accessing his memories properly? Could that be why none of this seemed right?
Very emotional.
Harry shook his head to try to clear it. This was all too much. It couldn't be true. How could any of this possibly be real? How could he have summoned an owl simply by holding up an envelope and shouting out something about it? How could his family history have been a secret hidden from his adoptive parents, even from Aunt Petunia? The only person who believed in magic was his mother. Why would anyone lie to her? What could possibly be gained from it? But he had to keep it together. If he lost himself, he wouldn't be able to find his way out of here, even if that meant admitting that magic was real and he really did belong in Hogwarts. It was true. His mother had said it was dangerous to keep children with magical talent in Muggle families because they could bring attention to the Muggle-born. He wasn't sure if that meant that there were Muggle governments who were actively trying to wipe out all witches and wizards, or if it was some internal conflict between witches and wizards that he didn't know anything about yet.
See Potter and the Board of Education.
His thoughts swam this time when Quirrell spoke. His words went over Harry's head, and he was left to stare up at the stone walls of Hogwarts Castle with a sick feeling of unease spreading through his body. The last few hours had been a blur, and he couldn't believe any of it. Maybe it was a dream, or a test, or even a curse of some kind, though it sounded too ludicrous. They went inside the castle, and Harry felt even worse. The hallways were dim, with flickering candles floating in the air, casting strange shadows on the walls. Professor McGonagall was walking in front of them, and Harry found himself trying to take in everything as quickly as possible without drawing too much attention to himself. The castle was so vast and grand that he felt he couldn't miss a single thing, but there was always so much to look at: the paintings with their animated occupants, the tapestries covering the walls, the strange creatures that darted from behind statues or under tables. He couldn't tell if they were real or not, though a few of them seemed to stare back with a human quality that made his skin prickle. And then they stopped outside a room where McGonagall knocked on the door and opened it without waiting for a reply. There was a huge man sitting at a table with a giant cat lying beside him. The man looked up in surprise, and Harry thought that he recognized him, though he couldn't place him. The deputy headmistress whispered something to the man, who nodded and pulled out a chair for Harry, gesturing at him to sit down. Harry's hand shook as he reached for it, his fingers gripping the edge of the chair tight enough to hurt. But it was solid and real. And the man at the table, his name was Hagrid. He had suddenly remembered, from some story or another that he couldn't quite recall. The huge man smiled at him gently and poured out a large mug of tea from a pot on the table. It was steaming and hot and smelled wonderful, and Harry sipped it tentatively, feeling as though he were going to spill it at any moment. They hadn't introduced themselves. Harry knew their names. Quirrell had called him Harry Potter, and this was Minerva McGonagall. He had never heard anyone else by that name. But the adults seemed to accept that he was Harry, and if he could play along, he might find out more about why they were doing all this.
Quantum Leap.
Quirrell left him alone with the two of them, and as the clock struck 11, McGonagall ushered him off to bed. Harry wasn't tired, but he agreed, and as they walked to his dormitory, she gave him a quick rundown of how things worked at Hogwarts, which he knew very little about, but was afraid to reveal, and then left him standing in a strange stone chamber with 4 boys around his age, looking as bewildered as he felt. They seemed to know that his last name was Potter. Was that normal? Were they all part of this conspiracy? He introduced himself to the room, but no one questioned him. He seemed relieved that he knew what was going on, and eager for any information he could share. The boys, Ron, Dean, Seamus, and Neville, were talking excitedly about getting sorted by the hat, and Harry nodded and asked questions like he knew what they were talking about, which was getting easier every moment. Ron and Dean knew a lot more than he did, and filled him in on everything he didn't know, including the existence of Muggle-borns in the different houses of Hogwarts. Harry still hadn't told anyone that he had never used magic before, only his mother. who now seemed so far away and unreachable, would believe that was possible. But something was nagging at him, a thought that wouldn't go away, despite his efforts to squash it. It was that none of these other boys would believe him, and no one else did. He suddenly felt as though he couldn't breathe, as if there was something pressing on his chest, forcing the air back into his lungs. What if they found out, somehow, that he didn't even know how to use magic? How to cast spells or fly or create potions or anything else that they could do? He'd be shunned an outsider even more than he already felt. After all this, everything he had done to prove that magic couldn't possibly be real, it hadn't changed anything. He still believed in it, despite himself, and it wouldn't go away. He wasn't a scientist, he was just another lost child of magic. The realization made him want to cry, and he lay down on his bed, trying to push away the thoughts. But they came flooding in again, as unstoppable
All
as
these
the
new
tide.
biases.
He had failed. He didn't know why he had wanted to succeed at something like this, but he had wanted to prove that there was nothing but logic, and now he was lost in a world he didn't understand, with a past that no one could explain to him, and a future that seemed even further away than before. He had been so certain that there was no way he could be right, and yet here he was, the chosen one, the boy who lived, surrounded by friends and teachers who believed in him, in a world where magic was real, and he would have to master it if he wanted to survive. This time,
That's some
he
heavy
was glad
exposition.
when sleep overtook him.
Wow. Here's how Hogwarts works. No pressure. This is what you're gonna have to do. Well, let's put this. No, you just go semester by semester. Take it 1 week at a time, but at the end of it, you better. You have a lot of shoes to fill. Anyway, that was chapter 1. Chapter 2 goes a little off the rail, in a good way, in an emotional way. I'm gonna do that shortly. I'm just gonna take a breather and also ponder just how many times I should really interject to this. I really shouldn't be the Mystery Science Theater 3001. That might be annoying. Or I better have some bangers. I don't know. More soon. In a bit. In a minute.